Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica podcast. Today, I'm joined by Marcus, and we're going to keep our series going on Paul versus Paul, looking again at 1 Corinthians to see if we can ascertain which Paul is the genuine one. As always, please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us out. I never realised how important that was until we had our own channel. If you could do that before the video begins, that would be really helpful. Marcus, over to you. What have you got for today?
Yeah, thank you very much for the floor again on First Corinthians. We won't achieve it today, so we will have another peek into it and also respond to some of your questions. We refer back again to this concordance, and in a second part today, I'd like to answer some of the questions which have been raised as a response to our last session on First Corinthians. One of the crucial questions which have always been asked is, how can we discern whether or not a verse or part of a verse has been present or hasn't been present in the text of the Marcionite collection, when the witnesses do not tell us anything about these verses? And for that particular question, we will see, and I try to show how important our concordance is, which compares the lexicography and the semantics between the Marcionite, so the pre-canonical, and between the canonical New Testament, particularly with regards, of course, to the Pauline letters. But as you will see, it's not just about the Pauline letters. It is, because we are dealing with collections, it is about a language of one collection vis-a-vis the language of another collection. Yeah, then we have seen this first overview. So what, according to our reconstruction and according to the witnesses, is part of the Marcionite letter to the Corinthians, the first one, that you can see on the left side. And on the right side, without the star, you see the canonical First Corinthians. We went through the beginning, so the prescript and the thanksgivings, which are all missing in the Marcionite version. And today, I'd like to go through with you the chapter 1 and particularly chapter 1. And the rest we will see in further sessions. So where you see chapter 1, verse 18, it's the proposition 1, it's the cross as foolishness and wisdom. This, as we will see in a bit later, is almost verbally taken up by the canonical redactors. And we will see the marginal differences, which I'm trying to explain. Before we go into that, I'd like to demonstrate first how we make up these decisions. And we look particularly into chapter 1 and the verses 29 and 30 and 31, because you can see the Marcionite reconstruction only gives us 2 of these verses, 29 and 31, whereas verse 30 is missing. And here is the reason why we have come up with this type of a reconstruction. Maybe we go quickly into the English translation of this text, because I don't think that you are all able to read Greek, but I'm happy to also take you through the Greek. But the English translation of the Marcionite text gives us here the following. So we just read 27, 28, 29, and then 31. But God has chosen the foolish things of the cosmic order to shame the wise things. And God has chosen the weak things of the cosmic order to shame the strong things. And God has chosen the ignoble things and the least things and the things scorned to nothings to abolish the somethings, so that all flesh may not be boastful before him. So that even as it has been written, let the one who is boastful boast in God. Now, as you can see, we have an alteration when we look into 1 Corinthians 1:29, because at the end, we are not reading before God or before the God. Enopion to theou is the Greek equivalent, but we only have before him. And this is as Tertullian attests it to us. Then Tertullian either has jumped over verse 30, or he indicates that verse 30 was not as part of his text. So he doesn't give 30, which is quite strange, because when you read the canonical text, and I just read out now 29 to 31, it runs as follows. So 29 is the conclusion of the reasoning before, which is almost identically taken without, well, just one thing that is missing this time in the canonical text, namely, and the last things, or the least things, and the least things, which is in the pre-canonical text, but it's missing in the canonical. But then it says, so that all flesh may not be boastful before God, or before the God. And then now from him you are in Christ Jesus, who came to be wisdom for us from God, justice as well as consecration and ransoming, so that even as it has been written, let the one who is boastful boast in the Lord. One wonders, of course. You can see the difference in Marcion. It says at the end, in God. In the canonical verse, it says, in the Lord. And that alteration, of course, picks up what is being said in verse 30. So this is the first indication that verse 30 might indeed have been missing in the Marcionite text. Because the witness does not give it. But there's also the kind of relation which this last alteration in Lord or in the Lord has, and which can only refer if verse 30 was present. But still, we could think maybe Tertullian had just a bit of a sleepy morning when he was commenting on this one here. So we look, as we in our reconstruction do, and I show you exactly what the commentary gives to the readers when it is being published with regards to the lexicography of these three verses, 29, 30, and 31. So if you just could go a bit to the other slide, which we have, yeah, a bit further down. So we look particularly into verse, let me just first have verse 29, please. So 29, as we have seen, is attested by Tertullian. And it starts with a Greek word, which is called a conjunction, which is called hopos, as, for example. And as you can see, it occurs at least 53 times in the canonical New Testament. But as the verse 129 is part of Marcion's Paul, because that is what Tertullian gives us, we have a confirmation that the lexicography is also a pre-canonical one, because already the hopos, which you can see, is also attested for the Marcionite verse in Galatians 1:4. So it starts with an otherwise attested conjunction. Furthermore, we then have this verb kauchaomai, so to praise or to praise, which occurs 37 times in the New Testament, and you will only find it in epistolary literature. And again, also this verb is confirmed in another place in Marcion's Marcion's Paul, namely in 1 Corinthians 1:29, even more in 31 and in 3:21. So we have a verb which reoccurs quite a number of times in the Marcionite Pauline collection. Of course, then we have sarx, flesh, and that is attested many times, not just in the canonical, but also in the Marcionite version. Then we have parsai, and that occurs 60 times as a feminine nominative or a vocative in either singular or plural. And this is only attested here. So we don't have any other place in Marcion's letters, but Tertullian gives it as being present in this particular place here. Then we have enopion. Enopion means in front of or in the face of. And here we can see enopion also is attested elsewhere in the Marcionite New Testament. This time, interestingly, not in Paul, but in Marcion's Gospel, which gives us a first relation. And you will see there are many, many of these cases where lexicography, which we find in the Marcionite Paul, will reoccur in Marcion's Gospel. So these two texts are semantically and linguistically very close to each other. But now comes an interesting element. You can see enopion tou theou. This is a combination. And this combination of the three Greek words, which means in the face of God or before God, tou theou of the God, yeah. This combination of the three terms we find 25 times in the canonical New Testament. For example, in Luke 1:19, in Luke 12:6. And when you then look into the reconstruction that are given by Roth, by Klinghardt, by Bedouin, you will see these are verses which are missing in Marcion's Gospel. So the combination that enopion tou theou, before God, does only appear in the canonical form of Luke, but not in the Marcionite Gospel. Tertullian seems to have read a different formulation, because he says, with regards to the Gospel, quod elatum est apud hominem prosus est Deo. The canonical formulation is to an anthropois hypsilon delugma enopion tou theou. And we can see it is only on the canonical level at all, with also the canonical Paul, because in Paul we have enopion tou theou elsewhere, namely in Romans 14:22, in 2 Corinthians 4:2, 7:12, and even in Galatians 1:20. All of these verses are not having either are absent from Marcion's Pauline letters or do not preserve enopion tou theou. So what we learn from here is we have a formulation which is a typical canonical formula. If we go back just a bit upstairs to the English translation, you will see it is therefore, as attested by Tertullian, where enopion appears, but it is before him and not before God. So this is the first explanation where we can see how supportive this type of lexicographical comparison is. And it is not just a word. It is quite often, as in this case, a combination of words. Here it is 3 words, which are 25 times present in the canonical text, and not a single time in either Marcion's Gospel or in any of Marcion's letters. Now let's go further down to verse 30, and then we will see how that comparison pins out. It already starts with a combination in the opening of the verse. which says autou de. Autou is a pronoun, so it is a genitive pronoun, and de means however. So of him, however. And this combination, again, of autou de only occurs in this place and in one other place in the canonical New Testament. It occurs in Acts 25:25. So here we start already with a verse opening, which is only to be found elsewhere on the canonical level. Then comes the verb form este, you are. And that occurs 92 times in the canonical New Testament. And of course, it also appears in the canonical text, in the pre-canonical texts. However, when we broaden this este, as it is in this text here, humeis este, you are, this combination again occurs 10 times in the New Testament. And surprise, surprise, it appears precisely in the Lucan verse that we had just dealt with before, with this enopion to theou. So in this very same verse where we discovered that this enopion to theou is a canonical alteration of this enopion as we have it in the Marcionite version. Here again, in the same verse, we also find the opening of verse 130, which only appears in the canonical text. So when you look how often and where this humeis este does appear, you can see it appears twice elsewhere, or 3 times even elsewhere, in canonical Paul. But then it also appears in Matthew, and again, as we have it with the autou de, it appears in Acts. So it corresponds to the canonical use of language. And here, again, very interesting, we see a proximity between this particular change and the book of Acts. Now we know that the book of Acts only was attached to the canonical New Testament around the times of Irenaeus. And this gives us an indication, at least, that these alterations which we are discussing here have not been made when the 10-letter collection of Marcion was again redacted by the canonical redaction shortly after he had published it in around the years 140. But that this part of an alteration here with this autou de, enopion to theou, humeis este, that these alterations we are discussing here are part of the what we call the second canonical redaction, which took place when the book of Acts became part of this New Testament, and when the 10-letter collection was moved to a 14-letter collection and stitched together with the book of Acts. And this has this reflection even in the language as we have it in front of us. And then comes that we are en Christo Jesu. This is an absolutely interesting combination. Why is that so interesting? We have Teresa Morgan's book, a full monograph, just on these 2 or 3 words, en Christo or en Christo Jesu. And she noticed that Paul has 3 ways of using en Christo, the canonical Paul. How does he use it? She says there are 2 standard usages when you have the conjunction en, or preposition rather, en, plus a person, Christos. This type of en plus a person throughout antiquity has been used for an instrumental explanation. So I'm doing it through Jack, yeah? En Jacko. Or The second way of using n plus a person in antiquity, and late antiquity even, is when we want to say not just instrumentally, I'll do it through the hands of, but if we say, I'll do it on the authority of. So I'm saying this because Jack has all the authority, and I'm doing it on his behalf and on his findings, en Jacko. So this is standard. And Teresa says, in Paul, this standard occurs 100 times. And then comes a third use, which is, as she says, an ontological use. She calls it that we are saying we are in the hands of somebody. So I'm in the hands of Jack means I can only live because Jack finances me or holds me or makes me breathe. So I'm in the hands of Jack. And this use, n plus a person, she did not discover it anywhere in any other author in antiquity, except for people who depend on Paul. So this is genuinely Paul. And I met Teresa last year at the SBL, and we discussed the case. And then I asked her and said, well, I was so impressed by your book, particularly because I then went back home and checked my concordance. And I discovered that the genuine use, the third use, in the hands of, is the only use in the Marcionite Paul. The general stuff, the hundreds of times that Paul, the canonical Paul, uses it in the sense of instrumental or by the authority of Christ, is always absent from Marcion. So I said to her, how can you explain that what you call the genuine, authentic Pauline use is the sole use in Marcion's letters? How would it be possible if an abbreviator were to cut out, for example, verse 13, or even just the 2 or 3 combined words, en Christo or en Christo Jesu? How would that be possible? That some abbreviator cuts out this non-genuine use and only leaves the genuine use of Paul. So whichever way we explain that, what we are saying is that the Marcionite Pauline letters preserve exclusive, genuine Pauline thinking. How can you explain that on the old theory? And she said to me, I need to go back and think. The best answer you can give as a scholar. What I'm trying to show you here is why and how the lexicography works, and why, for very, very good reasons, verse 13 is not just not mentioned by our witnesses, but is most likely absent. Because when we go back to the translation, 29, 30, yeah. And you can see now, from him, you are in Christ Jesus. Now from him is already a bit of a problem, yeah. Where does that lead to from him? Is that God? What's from him? Yeah, maybe God. So now from him you are in Christ Jesus, who came to be wisdom for us from God, justice as well as consecration and ransoming, so that even as it has been witnessed, let the one who is boastful boast in the Lord. And you can see this is not me being just in the hands of Jack, but it is me boasting in and on the behalf and in the authority and with the power of Christ. So you understand why verse 130 has been left out. We have several indicators, the verse opening from him now, and then the being in Christ, and we could go further. You will see this is the reason why it's not just a guesswork why we have taken out 130, but that it is on very, very good grounds. Both witness and lexicography confirm that this verse is a canonical construction. And we can even, if we want to do it, we don't do it in this reconstruction which is going to be published, but we could do it. And we have to do it in the future to nuance even further whether some redactional corrections have been done in the first canonical redaction or in the second. In this case, verse 30, I think it's pretty clear it is part of the second canonical redaction when Acts has been added to the New Testament. So this is just the start so that we get an understanding why we are ending with the type of reconstruction that we have done. But let's go back and do a bit more of theology. Yeah, we need to go to verse 118 following.
1 second.
Yeah. Fantastic, yeah. Could we do it a bit bigger? Yeah. Sorry about the beeps, but I will get a new charger cable quite soon, and then the beeps should stop. So here we've got a passage which is closely parallel in the pre-canonical and the canonical text. And it's one of the famous passages, of course, of 1 Corinthians. The cross of the anointed, or the cross of Christ, is folly to those being destroyed, but power and wisdom of God to the one being saved. And you see, there's only the additional "and wisdom," which is attested for the pre-canonical text, which is missing in our canonical 1 Corinthians. And then, for it has been written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and the insight of the insightful ones I will deny. Then the canonical has, in addition, where is the wise and where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this? I can't read it. Could we do it slightly bigger? Yeah, that's fine. That's much better. Yeah. Okay. So who is the disputer of this aeon? That's what it was. Yeah. And then jointly they have, has God not made foolish the wisdom of the cosmic order of this one? And so forth. Let me first go back to the first sentences here. Yeah. This is a passage from which we can learn something else. When Tertullian commented on verses 18, 19, and 20, he really got in the deep mud. And he was wondering, what is happening in this text? Because we have in verse 119 a prophetic quote. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and the insight of the insightful ones I will deny. If I remember rightly, it's from Josiah, or is it Jeremiah? I can't remember. Jack, you have the text in front of you.
For which, sorry?
For 119. We have it in the footnote 13.
Isaiah.
Yeah, it's Josiah, because Jeremiah comes later. Okay. So we have a quote from Josiah, and Tertullian gives it that this quote was part of Marcion's from 1 Corinthians. Now the question is, how do we interpret it? Tertullian thinks about 3 possibilities how to read it. He says, is this I will destroy, is the I the Jewish God? So would Marcion say that the cross of the anointed, the cross of Christ, is folly to those being destroyed, but that the cross is power and wisdom of God to the ones being saved? And the people who are being destroyed by the God of the Jews. So that the antithesis that Marcion wanted to say here is between the difference between the cross of Christ, which is the saving power for those who are saved. It's wisdom and power, God's wisdom and power of the transcendent God, of course, of the God of Christ. Whereas the prophets have God not as saving power, but as power that destroys the wisdom of those wise ones. So that's one way Tertullian says the text could have been read by Marcion, which is against our reading. And maybe even if we have the text in front of us as we have it, 1:18 and 19, we would say it's a pretty odd reading, even if Marcion were to have read it that way. And then, has God not made foolish the wisdom of the cosmic order of this one? Now, who is that God? Is that now the God of the Jews, or is it the God of the cross? Tertullian then tries to reread the text. If it were not the God of the Jews, if it were the transcendent God of Marcion's Christ, he says, if that were the case, but if Marcion then makes use of a prophetic saying, then how can he at the same time believe that the prophets have no knowledge of the Christ of the future, have no knowledge? And how can they not predict what is going to happen? Because it's a prophetic saying. So at the end, he tries to explain that Marcion could only have understood this text in the sense of the verse 1:19 being the antithesis of the rest of the text.
Interesting as well with this text that in Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians, where he gives a similar message, it seems to be either not from Paul or an earlier version of what Paul's trying to say, because he mentions that the cross is saving and all the rest of it, but he does not bring into the question the Jews or the Gentiles. They're an ignored group. Two groups. So it's interesting that although he does recognize, that the cross is saving, and we have basically this verse 18, but we don't have wisdom either. So it's just power to be saved. And so again, maybe another redactional element or an element of Pauline theology, but again, no recognition of Jews or Gentiles or those being destroyed in the equation.
As we can see, already the canonical redactors seem to have had some problems with this verse 19, because that is exactly where we have the redactional addition, where it says, Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of these aeon? So it indicates to me that exactly the same question being raised by Tertullian has already been raised by the canonical redactors. And potentially Tertullian was right that this "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones and the insight of the insightful ones I will deny" was understood by Marcion as an antithesis to the cross that is being seen as folly.
And the middle recension adds those questions into Ignatius too.
Very interesting. And we
affirm that
see
1
more
Corinthians.
parallels between the canonical redactors and the Ignatian redactors.
Yeah.
At the same time, what I learn from this text is that Marcion presumably had not invented this kind of an odd combination of verse 18 and 19. I guess he must have had in front of him, in his 7-letter collection, a letter to the Corinthians, a first letter to the Corinthians, which had already this prophet Isaiah verse in it. Maybe he was trying to redact verse 18 in such a way that he formulated a kind of an antithesis between the cross of Christ and what is being said by the prophet. But in this case, picked up by Tertullian for right and picked up by the canonical redactors for good reasons, he did not a great job. This is one of the classic texts, and that's why I'm trying to show it to you. This is one of the classic texts where I hope in the future, when we have more studies of the Marcionite Pauline letters, we will come to discern between those elements which give us hints with regards the source that Marcion was using and the kind of attempt of redacting this type of a source. So I think that if we want to ask whether it was Paul or whoever was who wrote the earlier version that Marcion was making use of, in this case, I think it gives us an insight that the pre-Marcionite 1 Corinthians was less Marcionite in its overall theology than the Marcionite version that we have here in front of us. That even the canonical writers have great difficulties in making sense, we can see from those questions. Let's go a bit further and then we come to a conclusion. So the text continues, "Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the cosmic order of this one? Since in the wisdom of the God, the cosmic order did not through wisdom know the Lord. The God was pleased through the folly of the proclamations to save those who trust. Since Judeans ask for signs, the Greeks seek wisdom." So far, it's okay. Here we have got an interesting continuation in verse 121, when there is mentioned that in the wisdom of God, the cosmic order did not through wisdom know the Lord. The God was pleased through the folly of the proclamation to save those who trust. So this picks up 1:18, where we have the distinction between the wisdom and the foolishness. And it is this play of words, that wisdom, as wisdom of this world, is rendered nothing. Whereas the foolishness, which is seen as foolishness of this world, becomes the real wisdom. And only in the real wisdom, you know that it is the cross of Christ. In 122, of course, we have a continuation of this type of, let's say, a criticism of Jews and Greeks, which would also refer back in the Marcionite version as a criticism of the prophets. Because if the prophets had known what wisdom, real wisdom, not cosmic wisdom, what real wisdom is, and if the Greeks in their religious traditions would have discovered real wisdom, they wouldn't have erred and they wouldn't have killed Jesus. Tertullian castigizes Marcion for this idea, although it's picked up by the canonical text as well. This is a stunning phenomenon that Tertullian criticizes Marcion for what the canonical text says too. Now, why is he so critical against Marcion? He says by discarding the prophets, you are saying that the Jews were asking for signs and the Greeks were seeking wisdom, but they didn't have it. They were not given those signs and they didn't understand them. Now, if the Jews had not understood what was given to them, if the prophets had no idea, how can one blame someone? And this is exactly what Tertullian is doing. He says, we can only blame the Jews for killing Christ if they knew exactly who he was. And with Marcion saying that neither the prophets nor the sign-seeking Jews nor the Greeks knew that they were killing the real Christ, they're off the hook. Hence, the whole slightly intricate and slightly problematic passage that we here have seems to be a rewriting, a not very well rewriting of and redacting of Marcion in order to set aside blame against the Jews and against the Greeks and reformulate it in a way that the prophets had already discarded the wisdom, and so that nobody had this wisdom until Christ made it clear in his cross. Tertullian is very unhappy with this type of a passage. Let's just end the reading. And so it's the cross that proclaims this type of a wisdom. And here for the Judeans is a scandal, for the Greeks a folly. But to them, to Judeans as well as to Greeks, Christ, the anointed, is God's power and God's wisdom. Because the folly of the God is wiser than humans. And the weakness of God is stronger than humans. And you can see this is the wrapping up, which also explains that in 119, the prophets even had no idea. The Jews, it's a scandal for them, for the Greeks it's folly, but they had no insight, and they couldn't have these insights. Hence, they couldn't be blamed for what happened with Christ. Interesting that also no mention at all is made of the Romans. The canonical text has a slight addition. In 124, we read that to them who are called, kletois in Greek. And the idea that the people have been called is a canonical idea. You will only find it in the canonical writings. And at the end, in 126, we read, for look at your calling. You see, again, something not mentioned in 24 is already being repeated again in a verse which is not present in the Marcionite version. And so you can see how the language works and how we can detect from small bits and pieces that we have a typical canonical edition. So now 26, for look at your calling, brothers, that not many were wise according to flesh, not many powerful, not many well-born. And here you can see this is a relativizing, a canonical relativizing, because it says, and it includes, some did know, some were powerful, some were well-born. And of course, that refers to the prophets. And it refers to those people amongst and in the Jews and in the Greeks who did recognize, maybe even the blame that they should have recognized what they did to Christ. And then comes again the parallel in 27. But God has chosen the foolish things of the cosmic order to shame the wise things. And God has chosen the weak things of the cosmic order to shame the strong things. And God has chosen the ignoble things. And Marcion adds, or it was taken out by the redactors, and the least things, and the things scorned, the things that are not, to abolish the things that are, so that all flesh may not be boastful before him. And him is quite clear. It is, of course, Christ, whereas in the canonical text, it turns to be God. Now from him, you are in the anointed Jesus. I think this is a verse here still in the translation, which we need to take out from the translation, which is an older verse, but it was already in brackets, but we are in need to taking it out. So that at the end, we have the finishing with a quote from Jeremiah. And again, here we need to correct the translation, because it doesn't say in the Lord in Marcion's text, it says in God. Yeah. So let no one, or let the one who is boastful boast in God. And a bit further up, we have read that we shouldn't boast in anybody, and that there is no boasting in God, particularly not that the flesh can have any boasting at all. Well, thanks very much for listening to this interpretation of chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians. And I'm looking forward to further sessions with you when we read further parts of this wonderful text of a Pauline letter. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.